I never imagined that the laughter of my own family would be the soundtrack to my humiliation. Hello, Creator. My name is Eleanor Vance. I'm 58 years old, and the story I'm going to share with you today is about how the truth, no matter how painful, can be the only key to freedom. If you've ever felt like a stranger in your own home, or if your family has ever made you feel small, please subscribe to the channel and tell me in the comments where you're listening to this story from. I love knowing where you all are. It was a Thanksgiving Sunday, a day that should have been about unity and gratitude. But for me, it was just another performance. My sister Martha's house in an elegant Atlanta suburb was filled with laughter and lively conversation, but I felt more isolated than ever. Mine old-fashioned ways, as they like to call them, were a constant source of jokes. My handmade wool dress, my insistence on using cloth napkins instead of paper, even my pumpkin pie recipe, passed down through generations, was the target of sarcastic comments. "Oh, Aunt Eleanor, you're so cute with those old-timey things," said my niece Brittany with a condescending smile as she showed off her new smartphone. "Nobody makes pie from scratch anymore, Auntie. There's an organic bakery that delivers to your door, you know?" The laughter that followed echoed through the room, and I felt my face burn. The humiliation was a suffocating weight, a constant reminder that I no longer belonged in that world, in that family I loved so much. I was the relic, the silent joke, the eccentric aunt they tolerated out of obligation. The pain of being mocked by my own family was a burden I carried at every gathering. They laughed at my old-fashioned ways, my preference for handmade things, my aversion to the technology that dominated their lives. I remember once, last Christmas, when I gave my nephew Michael a knitted sweater that took me months to make. He opened the package, forced a smile, and said, "Ooh, wow, Aunt Eleanor, that's rustic. But I already have about 10 designer sweaters, you know? And this one, well, this one doesn't match anything." The laughter of the others was like needles piercing my heart. I felt invisible, a shadow amidst the vibrant light of their modern lives. They talked about apps, cryptocurrencies, and international travel, while I tried, in vain, to share stories about community, about the importance of a good book or a walk in nature. "Aunt Eleanor, you're living in the last century," Grace, my own daughter, once told me, with a hint of exasperation in her voice. "You need to update yourself, Mom. The world has changed." I knew she meant well, but her words, though well-intentioned, only reinforced the idea that I was inadequate, obsolete. With each encounter, the exclusion became more evident. Conversations stopped when I approached. Eyes shifted away, and I was left aside, watching them from afar, as if I were watching a movie I wasn't part of. Humiliation was a constant companion, and I began to wonder if there was something fundamentally wrong with me. But deep down, a small flame of dignity refused to go out. I knew who I was, and my old-fashioned ways were part of my essence, my history, my soul. And maybe, just maybe, the problem wasn't me. On that same Thanksgiving Sunday, as the family dispersed through the living room, I retreated to the kitchen, seeking a moment of peace. I was washing dishes, the soft sound of running water calming me, when I heard muffled voices coming from Martha's office, which was next door. The door was ajar, and curiosity, something my mother always said was one of my old habits, made me stop. "I can't believe she still hasn't noticed," whispered Grace's voice, my daughter. She's so naive about these family matters, so stuck in the past." The tone of contempt in her voice hit me like a shock. It wasn't just about my old-fashioned ways. There was something more. "It's better if she doesn't notice," Martha's voice replied, deeper. "If Eleanor finds out the truth about what happened with Grandpa's will, everything will fall apart. She would never forgive us." My heart stopped. My father's will? He had passed away 5 years ago, and I always trusted that everything had been fairly resolved. But Martha and Grace's words, laden with a dark secret, sent chills down my spine. "What did you do?" I thought, feeling a wave of distrust replace the pain. Their laughter, which once humiliated me, now seemed to have a sinister tone. I felt isolated, mocked, but now a new emotion began to emerge. The certainty that there was a hidden truth, a truth they desperately concealed. And I was about to find out what it was. Those words, and Grandpa's will, echoed in my mind, turning the pain of humiliation into a cold flame of determination. My father, Arthur Vance, was a meticulous man. A retired accountant, he lived for details, and his will, I knew, would be no different. I remembered Dr. Peterson, his longtime lawyer, a man of unquestionable integrity. He had assured me, after the funeral, that everything was in order, that my father's wishes would be respected. But the conversation between Martha and Grace suggested otherwise. That night, back in my small apartment in Savannah, I couldn't sleep. Instead of lamenting my exclusion, I began to rummage through my memories, looking for any clue. I remembered a comment from my father, months before his death, about one securing Eleanor's futures and rather protecting the family legacy. He always worried about my well-being, especially after my marriage ended and I chose a simpler life, away from the hustle and bustle of the big city. The idea that Martha and Grace could have conspired against me, using my father's memory, was an even harder blow than any mockery. I decided to act. The next morning, I called Dr. Peterson's office. His secretary informed me that he had retired 2 years ago and that his files had been transferred to a young lawyer, Mr. Davies. A pang of apprehension hit me. New lawyers, new arrangements. But I wouldn't back down. I scheduled an appointment for the next day, feeling a mix of nervousness and a strange sense of purpose. The old-fashioned. Eleanor was about to show that she still knew how to fight. The visit to Mr. Davies' office, downtown Atlanta, was revealing. The young lawyer, though polite, seemed somewhat uncomfortable with my questions. He presented me with a copy of my father's will, identical to the one I already had, which divided his assets equally between Martha and me, with a small amount for Grace. However, when I asked about the ownership of the family's summer farm, a place my father loved, and which I always assumed would be jointly owned, Mr. Davies hesitated. "Mrs. Vance," he began, adjusting his glasses, "the farm was sold approximately 3 years ago. The sale value was distributed among the heirs according to your father's wishes." My mind reeled. Sold? My father would never sell the farm. It was his sanctuary, the place where he spent his summers, where he planted his fruit trees and told stories to his grandchildren. "That can't be," I said, feeling my voice catch. "My father would never do that without consulting me. He loved that place." Mr. Davies leafed through some papers. "Here is the sales document signed by your father and by your sister, Martha Vance, as power of attorney." A power of attorney? My father would never give Martha full control over his assets. He trusted me to manage things more than anyone. The coldness of that office, the formality of the documents, everything seemed to conspire to suffocate me. I felt a lump in my throat, but I refused to cry. Something was very wrong. Mr. Davies, sensing my distress, added, "Mrs. Martha Vance also requested an advance on part of the inheritance, claiming urgent health needs of your father, which was approved and deducted from the total amount." An advance on the inheritance? Urgent health needs? My father, Arthur, was a healthy man until his last few months, when illness struck him suddenly. He would never have allowed Martha to do such a thing without my knowledge. The final piece of the puzzle clicked into place. Martha, with Grace's help, had manipulated my father, perhaps in his last days of diminished lucidity, to gain control over his assets. The farm, our family's refuge, had been sold behind my back, and the money, which should have been mine, had been diverted. The anger, previously cold, began to boil. The humiliation I felt was just the tip of the iceberg. They didn't just mock me, they robbed me. With my mind buzzing with indignation, I left Mr. Davies's office with a folder full of documents and an overwhelming certainty I had been deceived. The farm, which I loved as much as my father, had been sold, and the money diverted. But I needed more proof, something that left no room for doubt. I remembered an old diary of my father's, where he recorded every detail of his life, including his finances and his plans for the future. He kept it in a cedar chest in the attic of the family home, now in Martha's possession. I decided I needed to go there, not to confront them yet, but to find the diary. That same afternoon, I drove the 2 hours back to Atlanta. I arrived at Martha's house unannounced. She opened the door, surprised, but with a forced smile. "Eleanor, what a surprise! I thought you were in Savannah." I forced a smile back. "Where I missed the family, and I wanted to pick up some old things my father kept in the attic. Remember the cedar chest?" She hesitated for a moment, but couldn't refuse. "Of course, dear. Make yourself at home." So, while Martha was distracted in the kitchen with Grace, who had arrived, I went upstairs to the attic. The cedar chest was there, dusty, but intact. I opened it, and at the bottom, under some old blankets, I found my father's diary. My hands trembled as I leafed through it, and there it was, in his impeccable handwriting, the truth. Detailed records of the farm sale, with dates and values that didn't match the lawyer's documents, and, most shockingly, an entry dated just weeks before his death, where he expressed his sadness that Martha hadn't insisted so much on selling the farm, and his confusion about ours where the money had gone. He also mentioned that Martha had pressured him to sign some papers that he didn't fully understand, but that I guaranteed were for the good of the family. The evidence was irrefutable. Martha had manipulated my father, probably in a moment of fragility, to sell the farm and pocket the money. And Grace, my own daughter, was aware of everything, complicit in the betrayal. I felt a wave of nausea. It wasn't just about money. It was about the betrayal of trust, the dishonor of my father's memory. I had their secret, the truth that would silence their laughter and reveal the true face of my family. The humiliation I had endured for so long now transformed into a weapon. With my father's diary in hand, I returned to Savannah, but the Eleanor who returned was not the same one who had left. The humiliation had given way to a cold, calculated determination. I had the truth, and the truth, as my father always said, was the most powerful weapon. I spent the following days immersed in Arthur's records, comparing dates, values, and notes with the documents Mr. Davies had provided me. Every line confirmed the betrayal. Martha had sold the farm for a value far below market price, and most of the money had been transferred to a joint account she held with Grace, under the guise of Monk's urgent medical expenses that never existed. My father, in his fragility, had been deceived by his own daughter and granddaughter. Anger consumed me, but I knew that revenge, or rather justice, should be served cold. The perfect moment for the revelation would be Thanksgiving dinner, the same setting where my humiliation had unfolded. I didn't just want to expose the truth. I wanted them to feel the weight of their actions, for their condescending laughter to turn into shock and shame. I began to plan every detail, like a landscape architect designing a garden, each element in its proper place for maximum impact. I called Martha, and with a voice that barely contained the irony, said I was looking forward to Thanksgiving dinner and would bring Aka's special contribution to the table. She, suspecting nothing, expressed her non-joyous at having me around. I knew the family would be gathered, all those who had laughed at me, all those who had benefited directly or indirectly, from my exclusion. It would be the perfect stage for my exposé. I wasn't seeking revenge in a petty sense, but rather a poetic justice, a turning of the tables that would restore my father's honor and my own dignity. Thanksgiving Day arrived, and with it, an almost palpable tension in the air, at least for me. I arrived at Martha's house with my special contribution. A cedar box, identical to my father's chest, but empty. I placed it discreetly in the living room, where everyone could see it, but without drawing immediate attention. Dinner proceeded as usual, with the same laughter, the same comments about my old-fashioned ways. I smiled, nodded, but inside, every fiber of my being was on alert. When dessert was served, ironically the pumpkin pie I had made, praised by everyone without knowing it was his from scratch, I stood up. "Dear ones," I began, my voice calm, but with an authority that surprised everyone. "Before we continue with the celebration, I'd like to share something I recently discovered, something my father, Arthur, left me." Martha and Grace exchanged nervous glances. I picked up the cedar box and opened it, revealing its empty interior. This box, which resembles my father's chest, represents something that was taken from me, and in a way, from all of us. I took a folder of documents and my father's diary from my bag. My father, Arthur, was a man of principles. He valued honesty above all else. I began to read excerpts from the diary, interspersed with the lawyer's documents. On May 15, 2019, my father wrote, "Martha insists on selling the farm. I don't understand why, but she says it's for the good of the family." And here, I said, showing a document, "Reads is the deed of sale, signed by Martha as power of attorney, for a value that is 1/3 of what the farm was actually worth." The laughter in the room had died. Everyone's eyes were fixed on me. "And the most painful thing," I continued, my voice choked but firm, "checks is that the money from this sale, which should have been divided equally between Martha and me, was diverted to a joint account of Martha and Grace under the false pretense of urgent medical expenses for my father, who, as we all know, was healthy until his last months." The silence in the room was deafening. Martha was pale, and Grace, wide-eyed, tried to hide behind her husband. "You laughed at my old-fashioned ways. You excluded me. You made me feel like a stranger. But the truth is, you robbed me. You robbed my father's memory and my dignity." The room erupted in whispers. My nephew Michael, who once mocked my sweater, looked at his mother and sister with disbelief. Aunt Susan, who always treated me with pity, now looked at me with respect. Martha tried to defend herself, stammering flimsy excuses about misunderstandings and needs. Grace, in tears, denied everything, but the evidence was irrefutable. I didn't scream, I didn't cry, I just stated the facts, coldly and calculatingly, and let the truth do its work. Their laughter had been silenced forever, replaced by a shame that burned more than any humiliation I had ever felt. That Thanksgiving dinner became a watershed moment in our family's history. The exposure of Martha and Grace's dirty secrets reverberated for weeks, irreversibly transforming the family dynamic. Martha's shame was palpable. She tried to justify herself to the other family members, but the evidence was overwhelming. Grace, in turn, isolated herself, unable to cope with the look of disappointment from her cousins and aunts. The condescending laughter that once haunted me had been replaced by an awkward silence, and for them, a public humiliation that far surpassed any pain I had ever felt. For me, the feeling was one of profound relief. The pain of betrayal still existed, but the lightness of having the truth exposed was liberating. I wasn't seeking revenge in the sense of causing suffering, but rather to restore justice and dignity. And that I had achieved. The family, once divided between those who laughed at me and those who ignored me, now looked at me with new respect. Some came to apologize for not having noticed what was happening. Others expressed admiration for my courage. The farm, though sold, would not be forgotten. With the help of a lawyer Mr. Davies recommended, I initiated legal proceedings to recover the fair value of my share of the inheritance. It wasn't about the money itself, but about the principle. Martha and Grace would have to face the consequences of their actions, not only in the court of family opinion, but also in justice. I knew the road would be long, but for the first time in a long time, I felt strong enough to walk it. My life, which once seemed stagnant in nurse old-fashioned ways, gained a new purpose. I continued with my passions, my pumpkin pies, and my cloth napkins, but now with renewed confidence. I had learned that true strength lies not in adapting to others, but in remaining true to oneself, even when the world tries to diminish you. That Thanksgiving Day taught me that sometimes the greatest lesson we can give to those who underestimate us is simply to reveal the truth. And the truth, no matter how painful, always prevails. The revelation at Thanksgiving dinner was just the prelude to a battle that would last for months, but for me, it was a matter of principle and justice. The following week, my lawyer, Dr. Miller, an experienced man with an impeccable reputation, filed the lawsuit. The legal action aimed not only at recovering the value of my share in the farm's sale, but also at annulling the power of attorney that Martha had fraudulently obtained and compensation for moral damages. News of the lawsuit spread like wildfire in our family, causing an even greater uproar than the initial revelation. Martha and Grace, initially, tried to minimize the situation, claiming I was exaggerating and that it was just a family dispute. But Dr. Miller left no room for doubt. He presented irrefutable evidence, my father's diary, the sales documents with discrepant values, and the bank transfers that showed the diversion of money. Their defense was based on trying to discredit my father, claiming he was senile and that the farm sale was his wish, which deeply revolted me. I refused to allow Arthur's memory to be tarnished. The family divided. Some, like my nephew Michael and Aunt Susan, who had witnessed the scene at dinner, sided with me, offering support and testimony. Others, fearing the repercussions or still under Martha's influence, distanced themselves. My daughter, Grace, was the hardest to deal with. She accused me of destroying the family and of lacking compassion. I, in turn, tried to make her understand that the destruction had already occurred the moment they chose greed over honesty. With each hearing, the tension increased, but I remained firm, remembering the condescending laughter and the betrayal I had suffered. The process dragged on for almost a year, an exhausting period, but one that strengthened me. I learned to navigate the legal system, to understand the language of lawyers, and to remain unyielding in the face of attempts to disqualify me. Dr. Miller was a tireless ally, and his faith in my cause gave me the strength to move forward. Finally, the day of the verdict arrived. The courtroom was packed with family members, friends, and curious onlookers. Martha and Grace were visibly nervous, their faces pale and their eyes fixed on the judge. The judge, with a grave and impartial voice, read the sentence. The power of attorney obtained by Martha was declared null, and the sale of the farm, although it could not be reversed, had its value reassessed. Martha and Grace were ordered to pay me the difference in the sale value, plus interest and substantial compensation for moral damages. In addition, the judge severely reprimanded their conduct, highlighting the manipulation and dishonor to my father's memory. The silence in the room was absolute, broken only by Grace's muffled sob. Justice had been served. It wasn't a financial victory I sought, but the validation of truth and the restoration of my father's dignity and my own. Martha and Grace, who once mocked my old-fashioned ways, now faced a considerable debt and the contempt of much of the family. Their laughter had been definitively silenced, replaced by a public shame that would accompany them for a long time. My daughter, Grace, finally seemed to understand the gravity of her actions, but the path to reconciliation would be long and uncertain. In the months that followed, my life flourished in a way I never imagined. With the compensation money, I decided to fulfill an old dream, open a small craft and homemade goods store, a place where my old-fashioned ways would be valued. I named it Eleanor's Hearth and Home, a refuge for those who, like me, appreciated the beauty of handmade things and the authenticity of simple things. The store became a success, attracting customers who sought more than just products. They sought a connection, a story. My relationship with Michael and Aunt Susan deepened. They became my biggest supporters, helping out at the store and celebrating my achievements. As for Martha and Grace, contact became sporadic and formal. They paid the debt in installments, and each payment was a reminder of the truth that had been exposed. Grace, in particular, seemed to carry a weight. She sought me out a few times, not to ask for forgiveness, but to try to understand. I received her with an open door, but with the clarity that trust, once broken, takes time to rebuild. Today, sitting in my store, surrounded by the scents of cinnamon and lavender, with the soft sound of an old record player playing jazz, I realized that the greatest victory was not the legal one, but the personal one. The humiliation I had endured pushed me to seek the truth, and the truth set me free. I learned that true wealth is not in what you accumulate, but in the integrity of character and the strength of spirit. My old-fashioned ways were not a weakness, but rather the foundation of my resilience. They were my essence, my truth, and that truth, once revealed, silenced the laughter and transformed the pain into a new and sweet beginning. I, Eleanor Vance, the woman with old-fashioned ways, was finally at peace.